Hey everyone, so welcome to my second channel. I wanted to do a series of videos in which I go over my old notebooks. They're very old. I think this one is from 2011. I would have been 17 at the time, working somewhere in central London, and at the time, I was incredibly obsessed with psychedelics. I had very recently discovered them. I don't really trip anymore, but it was kind of the height of my fascination with them. They were a very new thing, and I felt like a teenager that had discovered a chemical portal to inner space, and I was shocked and appalled that nobody else was talking about it. So I was listening to a lot of Terence McKenna lectures, and he was saying that we're not going to understand the psychedelic experience until we map it out. So I thought maybe I should do that. And it actually started in this notebook. I'm going to go through 3 different notebooks. This is probably the least impressive of them in some ways, but it was the start of my psychedelic research career, so I'd like to go through it. So here we have, I have no idea what I'm talking about, which is probably kind of a sentiment precursor to my first blog, Disregard Everything I Say. And let's see here, I'm just gonna skip past that because it's not particularly profound. So here we have the absolute, let's move that a bit. Here we have the absolute first rendition of the subjective effect index, or my attempt at categorizing subjective effects of psychedelics, which eventually became the article, The Visual Components of a Psychedelic Experience, which I posted onto my Tumblr blog in 2011, disregardeverythingisay.com. So looks like it's kind of interesting just to look back at how I used to think about these things, because a lot of it I've forgotten about, and some of it I find quite difficult to decipher. But let's read some now. So it says LSD. Visuals associated with psychedelic experience. Traces/trails/lag. I don't refer to it as lag anymore. Naming conventions have definitely changed over the last 13 years for myself. Traces are a simple experience of trails being left behind moving objects, such as people walking or cars. An obvious trail left behind my hand as I move it in front of my face is usually the first visual clue that the drug is working for me. The colors of the trails are usually the same color as the moving object. Next we have increased brightness of colors, which these days is called color enhancement. So a simple visual effect that has to be experienced to be understood. I don't really agree with that anymore. During a trip, all colors seem to stand out and be far more crisp than usual. Reds will seem redder, greens will seem greener, etc., etc. Breathing. Breathing is a very commonplace visual effect that can happen to any surface or object, but is usually associated with walls. Don't really agree with that anymore. It's not usually associated with walls. The visual effect is when a surface or object appears to be slowly expanding and contracting in a similar way to a person's chest moving up and down when they take deep breaths. So these days that is a subcomponent of drifting, which you can see on my upcoming drifting video that will be released on my main channel soon. And flowing textures, these days it's just called flowing, another subtype of drifting, along with breathing, spinning, morphing. So flowing. Shifting or moving textures can happen on virtually anything in different ways. A typical example of this would be a wood grain pattern flowing like a river, or a bathroom rug. A bathroom rug's individual fluffy bits writhing like a mass of worms. See, a bathroom rug's individual fluffy bits writhing like a mass of worms. That just sounds like drifting, not flowing specifically to me. Shifting colors. This is called color shifting now, or color transformation. So quite often, the colors of things, particularly brightly colored things, will shift and change color in a strange sort of fluid motion. This typically happens to be on objects such as flowers, moss, or anything that stands out from its environment in terms of color already. This one's interesting because it's not really present in the subjective effect index in the way that it's written Here, I'd say it comes under visual acuity enhancement or even novelty enhancement. But here's what I wrote. This is an interesting visual effect, as it does not change the appearance of textures, but rather a person's feeling towards them. During even a mild trip, it is common for people to suddenly notice patterns and textures that they have previously never appreciated or paid any attention to. For example, when looking at a carpet, a pavement, or particularly trees, the complexity and beauty of the texture/pattern becomes prevalent. Another interesting aspect of this effect is that it partly stays with people after a trip, giving them a newfound appreciation of patterns and textures. It has been said that the reason for this effect is that drugs such as LSD allow a person to look at something such as a tree and comprehend the positions and complexity of the various parts as a whole, rather than a small fraction at a time. Personally, this feels very true for me. So, it has been said that LSD allows people to comprehend the positions and complexity of the various parts of their visual field as a whole. Who said that? I don't know who said that. Maybe that's me thinking about McKenna's stoned ape theory, but I'm not really sure what I meant there. And I mean, I'm 30 now, so this was 13 years ago. Moving on, melting. It is not unusual for objects and sceneries to appear to be melting, in a similar way to the famous Salvador Dali melting clocks painting. However, objects usually only appear to melt when the tripper is directly staring at the object and will immediately unmelt as soon as the tripper focuses on something else for even a fraction of a second. It is also common for objects to appear to be constantly melting, but never making any actual progress, despite it melting before your eyes at the same time. This effect can only be understood by someone who is experiencing it or has experienced it. See, this seems relatively accurate, but I mean, melting's a really basic visual distortion. It can be understood. You can replicate it in After Effects. It's not ineffable or incomprehensible. I'm probably going to be disagreeing with my teenage self quite a lot here. Transformations and distortions. Interesting, I lumped those together here, because now I'd consider transformation to be more of a hallucinatory state, more so than a distortion, but oh well. This visual effect can vary widely in its intensity and distinctiveness depending on the trip and the tripper's dosage. At a low level, an example of this could be a stretching and distortion of somebody's face into a hilarious or perhaps sinister caricature of themselves. And at a higher level, can be the complete transformation of the external world into an incomprehensible anything. The most common variation of this effect that I experience is various things slowly turning into faces, such as the branches of a tree turning into a distinct but non-threatening demon face, similar to a famous Japanese no mask. Okay, so that must have been a specific transformation that I experienced as a teenager, and this subjective effect that I've written here seems to be several different subjective effects combined into one, sort of different open-eye hallucinations and distortions. These days, I would consider transformations to be their own visual effect or hallucinatory visual effect within that category at least, and distortions to be a type of subjective effect. You know, there's visual distortions, auditory distortions, even tactile distortions. Embedded patterns. So I think this eventually got renamed to symmetrical texture repetition. This is yet another visual aspect of the psychedelic experience that applies to textures. This visual effect differs from flowing textures because instead of distorting an existing texture, it completely replaces it with a usually fantastical one. An excellent example of this that I commonly experience is seeing a complex, repeating snowflake-like pattern embedded into grass or indescribable Aztec fractals. I used to call geometry Aztec fractals, which I think is cute, made from the surface of such things as pavements or any other surface that is embedded onto, which can quite often be anything and everything. Okay, so this would later be split up into two separate subjective effects. There's symmetrical texture repetition, which is when textures, usually grass or asphalt or any rough texture really, becomes mirrored in a symmetrical fashion, and kind of these intricate patterns and faces arise out of it. And you can replicate that just by mirroring a texture that you've taken a picture on from straight on. And then Aztec fractals is geometry. Because when I first started experiencing geometry as a teenager, I don't think I really knew what a fractal was, in that it's a shape that repeats recursively no matter how far you zoom in. But I was seeing a lot of trippy shapes, and to me they were very Aztec themed. So I called geometry Aztec fractals until I had a better name for them. This one's interesting because it's not in the subjective effect index at all, and I'd completely forgotten that I'd ever even documented it. So I assume it's a thing. I even drew a little diagram. Environmental concentric circles are a phenomenon that I had great difficulty naming, and even greater difficulty conceiving of a way to describe it. Environmental concentric circles are a visual that often appears when focusing on something, but also while simply looking around. What happens is the central point in your vision that you are focusing on stays still as it should, but around it the background swiftly flies into place from outside of your view and briefly appears to look like concentric circles made from the environment itself. Interestingly, for several weeks, this visual would constantly appear as I was reading books. The letters flew around whatever single word I was currently focused on, and surprisingly didn't distract at all. See, this is weird because I assume it's a legitimate effect. It sounds like I was experiencing it, but I have no memory of experiencing this particular effect. For example, with the previous effect, I remember seeing these snowflake patterns embedded in grass at my very first trip. I remember seeing geometry as I looked over the ocean and thought, wow, Aztec fractals, but environmental concentric circles? I don't really remember that. Synesthesia. Synesthesia is a visual aspect that among day-to-day sober people could be as prevalent as 1 in 23 people. This condition can be experienced in many ways other than psychedelics, and simply put is a mixture of senses. The most common version of this is seeing sounds and music, but can appear as any possible combination of senses, such as tasting colours or hearing smells. An example of this that I personally experienced is seeing the taste of peanut butter and chocolate spread on toast, which looks like a river of chocolate spread and a river of peanut butter floating in black space and colliding into each other as the taste blend into a mixture. I remember that experience. I was standing in my kitchen at nighttime eating a chocolate and peanut butter toast sandwich thing, and I saw it very vividly. I think it was just on weed. Maybe metazapine was also involved, of all things. Whatever. Scenery slicing. Scenery slicing is a fairly uncommon visual that makes it appear as if the scenery has been cleanly sliced with a razor, remarkably cleanly into separate slices that can be as simple as 3 clean slices through the scenery, or as complex as spiral-shaped interlocking slices that gradually spin. Typically, these are only experienced on stronger trips. So I had this one a few times back in the day, and I haven't really had it much since. It seems to be more common on dissociatives, but scenery slicing did make its way into the subjective effect index under that particular title, and it remains there to this day. You can look it up and check out replications and stuff. Closed-eye visuals. Okay, so I think this is actually just geometry. Closed-eye visuals are, in my opinion, the most exciting and indescribable element of a typical psychedelic experience. There are multiple levels of closed-eye visuals, each increasing dramatically in intensity. As with most visual effects associated with psychedelics, this effect is practically impossible to describe and show to people in any meaningful level of detail that can be understood without having a first-hand experience with these things. However, I will do my best. Okay, so I am referring to geometry here, and it looks like I came up with a rudimentary leveling system, which I know is quite different from the leveling system I use these days, but let's check it out. Level 1, visual noise. This is the most basic level of closed-eye visuals. that can be experienced in normal waking consciousness. It can be described as random light/dark red regions that can be seen under the eyelids. Level 2, light/dark flashes. This level is also accessible without the use of psychedelics and appears as regions of fleeting dark or light patches of color. Level 3, patterns, motion, and color. This is a level where things start to get distinctively psychedelic, and complex shapes that are indescribable begin to show themselves. These patterns quite often appear to be fractals or fractal-like. 4, objects and things. This is a fairly deep state where a person's closed-eye visuals become overlaid onto the physical world when one opens their eyes. These complex visuals can manifest themselves as a semi-translucent, oily sheen over a person's vision, or even as objects and things. Okay, so it looks like I am combining internal hallucinations and imagery with geometry rather than having them as separate effects. There seems to be a common trend where, in the earlier days of subjective effect documentation, I would combine many effects together, and then as time went on, I would start to tease them out from one another. Level 5. Overriding physical perception. This is the point where the closed-eye visuals have become so intense, vivid, and bright that they have blocked out and covered up the external world. This is known as breaking through to many people, as during such an intense trip, a person feels as if they have broken through to another dimension. To anybody else, however, the tripper appears to be either highly incapacitated or almost unconscious. Interesting. Let's see what else is in here. Okay, some drawings. Okay, it looks like I'm comparing LSD and mushrooms here, breaking up into duration, onset, body high, headspace, character, and visuals. It's interesting. Body high for LSD is described as tingling, energetic, and stimulating. Mushrooms, lazy, chilled out, lethargic. Headspace for LSD, introspective, euphoric, and clear-headed. Mushrooms, introspective, outrospective, which is a word I made up. I mean, rather self-explanatory, but contemplative periods in which you think really intensely about the outside world. Confusing, stoned, and natural. Character, synthetic and electric, versus natural cosmic intelligence. I was listening to too much Terence McKenna because I wouldn't really agree with that part now. I think that's a cultural thing that mimetically propagated into my brain rather than a fundamental aspect of the mushroom trip. Visuals. Sharp, cartoony, geometric patterns for LSD and soft, blurry, round hallucinations/visions. And I find this very fun because right here I wrote, does a drug wiki already exist? So you can see in 2011 the idea for Psychedelic Wiki was just kind of brewing in my brain. I didn't make it for another 3 years, but I was questioning it. Apparently I have no recollection of writing that down. Oh, here I drew Terence McKenna. It was so bad I put a post. Okay, so this is interesting because it looks like my attempt at documenting the difference in geometric style variations or style variations of geometry for LSD, MDMA, and mushrooms. So, what did I write? The last 3 times I've taken MDMA, it has given me intense closed-eye visuals that are enough to suddenly make MDMA psychedelic in its own right. The visuals in MDMA are very different from LSD, and have given me an insane amount of social hallucinations as I've tried to drift off to sleep. I think by social hallucinations, I was describing the experience of hallucinating solid social environments, for example, talking to friends or things that happened throughout the night before I started falling asleep. There's definitely a delirium aspect to MDMA, and I was certainly picking up on that back then. So, let's see. So LSD visuals, it's a little hard to decipher, but they are bigger in size. They are more angular in their corners. Mushrooms are big in size, but they are curved in their corners, and they have softer edges, versus LSD here that has sharper edges. I eventually made this into a digital diagram that actually kind of propagated throughout the internet. I never included MDMA in the digital one though. And from this you can see that MDMA has sharp edges, angular corners, and it's very zoomed out. It's like when you turn the resolution too high on your computer and everything's small, that's what MDMA geometry is like, for me at least. The patterns seen on MDMA are just as detailed and complex as the patterns on LSD or shrooms, but are smaller, more zoomed out, and finer than the large geometric patterns seen on LSD. The most unique aspect of the MDMA trip is the social hallucinations that I have seen the past 3 times I've taken MD. These were hallucinations that focused almost exclusively on friends, fictional people, and conversations. As I closed my eyes, I saw entirely fictional but coherent faces of imaginary people fly in and out of view. Each time I realized that the image I was staring at wasn't real, it would quickly change into something or someone else, and I'd quickly become distracted/captivated once again. The most notable visions that were induced that night was seeing a portrait flat screen mounted on my wall and an old man's face slowly scrolling from the bottom of the screen to the top before stopping as the face sat still and stared. See, I've drawn a little diagram here. Another was constantly seeing a branch of a berry bush that was floating above my head. This was a branch that I ate a berry off of at the trip spot earlier that day. Oh, okay. The trip spot being a spot in a forest near where I grew up, where me and my friends would trip. I will not reveal the location. The first time that I got these visuals, I attributed it to the fact that I had a 3-gram mushroom trip earlier on in the day, but the second time I had only MDMA in my system, and it happened again. This is pretty interesting, because almost all of the people who I had tripped and buzzed with reported extremely similar visuals. This is extremely interesting, because MDMA is not even regarded as anything more than a mild psychedelic at best. There's a lot of people online, or at least back in the day, who say MDMA is not a hallucinogen. And it's not primarily a hallucinogen, but my god, it can definitely be a hallucinogen. Oh, here we go. So, forgotten LSD visual. Extreme pareidolia. During an acid trip, a person's natural sense of pareidolia is increased many times over. This has the effect of allowing people to recognize significant images, such as faces and people, in almost any random and vague stimuli. For example, every leaf on a tree might look like hundreds of little green faces, or clouds might be much more easily recognizable as various objects and images than usual. Another aspect of this visual that I often experience while tripping in busy public places is seeing every other person as somebody you recognize. I get that one to this day. And then I have a list of victimless crimes. Okay, not that. But yeah, this is called, I think it's just called pareidolia enhancement or increased pareidolia these days in the subjective effect index, as opposed to extreme pareidolia, which sounds a little sillier. Okay, so this is not subjective effect index related, but at the time I was listening to a lot of Terence McKenna, as I mentioned, and I was becoming obsessed with this idea of the universe being an engine for exponential self-complexification. So I remember looking up all the different stages of what I deem to be significant events in history and figuring out the percentages for how long those things have existed in 3 different stages. So there's modern humans, Earth, and what's the third one? The universe. So, I have the dates for everything here. First, anatomically modern humans, agriculture, writing, electrical battery, first electronic computer, invention of the internet, and beginning of the information age. So, we have been hunter-gatherers for Wait. We have had agriculture for 4.7% of history. Interesting. Human history, I mean. We have had written language for 3% of history. Not very long. We've been using electricity for 0.1% of history. We've had computers for 0.03% of history. And we have been in the information age for 0.01% of history. And then apparently we were also hunter-gatherers for 95.3% of history. Human history being when the first anatomically modern humans arose, around 200,000 years ago. These days I would add another stage to that, which is the rise of AI, because I think that's probably going to be as big as the rise of the internet, but maybe it's just a hype train, I guess we'll see. Okay. So, formation of Earth, 4.5 billion years ago. We have had simple cells for 83.5% of Earth. We've had photosynthesis for 65.9% of Earth. We've had complex cells for 43% of Earth. We've had multicellular life for 21.9% of Earth. We've had simple animals for 13% of Earth. We have had complex animals for 12% of Earth. We have had mammals for 4.3% of Earth. We have had the Homo genus for 0.05% of Earth. And we have had modern man for only 0.004% of Earth. So, I mean, I hope you can see what I'm kind of getting at here. I always thought it'd be cool to have a web page that updates these numbers in real time. And then for the final zoom out, we have the universe as starting with the Big Bang, 14.7 billion years ago. So we have had matter for 99.995238% of existence. We have had hydrogen and helium atoms for 99.9974218% of existence. We have had stars for 99.3197279% of existence. I have no idea if this math is correct. This is just based on the research I was doing 13 years ago when I was supposed to be working at work. We have had galaxies for 95.9% of existence. We've had Earth for 30.05% of existence. We have had life for 25.85% of existence. We have had multicellular life for 6.8% of existence. We have had complex animals for 3.74% of existence. We have had the Homo genus for 0.017% of existence. We have had civilization for 0.00005% of existence. So I think what I was trying to convey here is that complexity is exponentially increasing as the universe ages. And that's not an idea that I came up with. I got that idea from Terence McKenna. In hindsight, Carl Sagan spoke about it a lot too with his cosmic calendar. And it's definitely an idea that's always fascinated me. It does seem to be a function of the universe, or maybe it's just a byproduct of entropy or complexity as a whole. I don't know if it's an actual physical property in terms of the laws of the physics, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else of note in here. Some rambles on free will, which I don't really know if I'm going to get into that now. First Salvia breakthrough. Okay, I smoked a bottle of Salvia leaves while already at roughly a 6, presumably on weed. Immediately I felt myself being pushed into the flatland world, and I could feel my bed tensing up with that odd Salvia sensation where I forget how my limbs work and where I am, etc. Since these were just leaves, I was not expecting to be pushed any further than this, but just as it seemed to be dying down, I found myself tumbling through some sort of confusing dark psychedelic space in third person. I could feel myself as some sort of conveyor belt, and was reminded of people discussing this exact feeling on Reddit and understanding what they meant. This was my first truly enjoyable Salvia trip that I broke through on, and even though it was my hardest Salvia trip yet, it felt more gentle somehow. Oh yeah, after the conveyor belt, I felt and saw myself being split in half down the middle, as I laid back, floating in space. Although it was uncomfortable, it was not a violent, gory mess, but I broke apart into two sections vertically down the middle of my chest, as if I was made to do that, and my legs started curling up as they were peeled off. And here I have this little diagram, as you can see. Even more accounts of Salvia. Okay, so Flatland. Flatland is a place I have visited 5 times during Salvia trips, and have been terrified by 3 out of those 5 times. So let's go through the accounts. This first time I reached Flatland, my vision and sense of self became part of a flat 2D wall. I found I could no longer reach forward because my flattened vision wouldn't let me, as my room was on either side of my arm and in the way, despite being far away from my hand. At this point, I gave up and stopped trying to smoke more. And as you can see, here's a diagram. You can zoom in. Okay, so this guy, because he's on a flat piece of paper, he cannot move left or right because on all sides of him, there's the sky, the grass, and it's solid. It's encasing him, and I guess that's how I felt on Salvia. The second time to me was when I realized that the feeling of flatness was consistent and not a one-time thing. As I began the trip, I hadn't even given the flatness a though and a thought, I don't know, and it was not at all on my mind. Despite this, I was immediately hit with the same feeling and reminded of my last trip. I hallucinated my friend sarcastically making fun of me by singing "Welcome to Flatland," as if he was singing the opening to a kids' TV show. This is how Flatland got its name. Oh yeah, I remember that. We were sitting in the forest at the time. Okay. I haven't looked at this in a long time. I'm reading it for the first time in many years. The third time was much more intense and interactive than the previous 2, because I decided to smoke out of a large bong instead of a small water pipe. The room immediately went flat and broke into sections. I thought I was on the other side of the room and had folded and stretched one of my friends as a section across the room, which I realized was a bad thing to do. I felt a sense of regret. We were put into position shaped like a sideways capital H, back to back, with our legs doing the splits, and began to rotate. My friend asked, "Are you happy now?" as we rotated, and as I sobered up, my vision was split into clear sections, one of which I tried to fold in half because I felt the need to. And then here's a fun diagram of how me and my friend were as we were rotating. Okay, on my 4th time. On my 4th attempt, I used salvia leaves, and this was the first time I truly pushed past Flatland, and it wasn't the main focus of the trip. It was this trip that made me realize that there's more to salvia than a sinister mindfuck. Okay, I guess that's the end of it. Oh my god, I'm describing my first ever DMT breakthrough. 3rd of September, 2011. Jesus Christ. Okay. I'm old. I finally had my first true DMT breakthrough on Saturday, and although my memory of it is hazy, as if it was a hard-to-remember dream, most of it I can't even imagine in my head, as it was so quick and didn't make sense, but some of it can be written about. The breakthrough was very sudden. I heard a ringing sound in my head and saw the very detailed glass-like patterns floating in my room, and then it hit me like a ton of bricks. I closed my eyes and myself in a psychedelic version of London by the park entrance near Villiers Street, close to my work. There was a middle-aged, tall biker man standing in front of me, with his arms crossed. I was worried for a second that he might be a threat, but then we started talking about something that I have no memory of. Memory gap After flying through different spaces, presumably in London, still, as I don't recall ever really leaving it, I felt as if I must be coming down. Just as I thought this, I found myself in a space with a pinkish-purple female face looking over me and saying something to me. I remembered in the trip that I had access to much more DMT, and that I would be revisiting this place very soon. I started to come down, felt incredibly euphoric and amazed for roughly half an hour. This was the hardest I've tripped ever. Wow, honestly, this is really nostalgic for me. I had no idea that I wrote a trip report for my first DMT trip. I mean, I remember it vividly, but I didn't know that I wrote a trip report. Weirdly enough, this memory gap part, in my memory when I recall the trip, I thought I was standing there talking to a biker, and then I flew up into the sky above London. And that's where I met a pink goddess face in the sky. But here I have a memory gap, even though I'm closer to the experience than I am now. So now I'm wondering if that flying over the sky part was created in my head, just to fill in a memory gap. Or if I eventually recalled that memory over time, but didn't have access to it when I was writing this, how many years ago? 12 years ago. Oh my god. Okay. Okay, so some Terence McKenna stuff, I guess, whatever. Nitrous oxide and 1 mg of DMT. 1 mg doesn't seem like a psychoactive amount, so that isn't quite right. After smoking a small dose of DMT and experiencing the detailed, intricate visuals that came along with it, I immediately took some N2O and for a split second found myself in a world of nothingness. I had to regain my sense of self and what was happening as I rematerialized into my room. The usual laughing gas and psychedelic combination effects. However, when I opened my eyes, there were no geometric patterns or anything associated with tripping. Instead, everything looked incredibly stylized, brightly coloured and cartoony. Rob's, that's an old friend of mine, Rob's head was in 2 sections that jutted back and forth to the audio vibrations of the nitrous. The deflated balloon in my head was doing a similar thing, and for a brief moment, when I looked up at my giant DS... Did I used to have a giant DS? What am I talking about? Shit, that rings a bell. Okay, whatever. My giant DS, everything went 16-bit like a video game for a second or two. These visuals were nothing at all like any trip I've ever had, and whilst boringly simplistic, they completely overpowered my visual field. It looks like I just read the glandular humpkin. Yeah, I wonder what that is. Some ramblings on induced happiness versus genuine happiness. Induced happiness being euphoria, and genuine happiness being based on your circumstances. I think I wrote a Disregard article about that, but I don't really want to go into it right now. Salvia / LSD breakthroughs. 17th of September 2011. This is the first time I've ever mixed salvia with LSD, as I've usually been too nervous to try it. I smoked the salvia out of the bong and closed my eyes. I found myself being pulled backwards and upwards into an intense psychedelic space. In front of me was an entity that looked like some sort of Egyptian god with an animal head, although I can't remember what animal. I think it looked like Anubis. Might have been a deer or a monkey. Man, I swear to God, my brain is just filling in memories, because I have memories of these trips, but they disagree with what I'm reading, which are much closer, because I thought it was like an Anubis, but here I say a deer or a monkey. Human memory is bad, I guess. The entity was breaking apart into horizontal patterned lines and walked forward to place something by a tree. After this, I vaguely remember seeing 3 or more entities standing around looking at me. This lasted less than a minute, and I immediately came down back into the room. This is the most intense breakthrough I had that day, but as soon as I came down, I decided to smoke more. Salvia has a strange effect of keeping me completely attached to the room and able to communicate with the people in it by speaking, but at the same time floating through what appears to be a huge universe based on mathematical shapes and fractals. I was slowly floating above a giant orange-brown cube-like fractal that went on for miles and miles. It seems like LSD completely removes the tension and uncomfortableness of salvia to make for a much more enjoyable experience. Does it though? Does it remove the tension? I'm much more of a scaredy cat when it comes to these things than I was back then. I used to just go full force and not give a shit. 5-MeO adults. Okay. 5-MeO when smoked produces the most impossibly intense body high that's unlike any other psychedelic I've tried. It feels like an intense rush that just goes on and on for roughly half an hour. The rush is accompanied by some mild, false-feeling visuals. The visuals felt false, okay? I've yet to try this drug orally with success yet, but I suspect this drug has a lot to offer. Oh, and here I'm documenting a visual distortion. Seems in the early days of subjective effect documentation, I primarily focus on visuals, and visuals are the easiest thing to describe, in my opinion. Complex and subtle emotions and cognitive states are much trickier to describe from personal experience. It is very common to experience extreme and subtle perspective distortions during a psychedelic experience. This is where depths and layers of the scenery in front of you can become very exaggerated or skewed. A classic example of this I often experience is the swapping of layers in a scenery. This is where objects in the background come into the foreground and objects in the foreground go into the background. This almost consistently happens when laying down under a tree and looking at the sky through the branches, causing the sky to be in front of the branches and the branches behind. This can also happen in the form of complete loss of depth perception, when different sections of scenery, both close up and far away, will unify into one flat pattern. Aha! So, after, I guess, the viral success, at least by my standards, back in the day of the visual components of the psychedelic experience, I was like, right, got to do the cognitive or mental components of the psychedelic experience. So, this was my very first attempt at that. Let's see what I came up with. Time distortion. 2 to 4. Don't know what that represents. Time distortion comes in 3 commonly experienced forms. These forms are time compression, crossed out and written with constriction. I just call it time compression these days. Time dilation and time loops. Time compression is the felt experience of time speeding up, and is much less common than time dilation, which is a felt experience of time slowing down. Time dilation can vary between the simple effect of a trip seeming to have gone much longer than it actually has, until somebody checks the time and snaps back into reality, or it can be an unpleasant effect known as moments of eternity, where all concept of passing time is lost completely and a person feels as though they are trapped within the moment forever. It's not always unpleasant. I must have just had a bad time of it. Time loops are commonly a large factor in contributing to bad trips. This is the feeling that an event or moment is continuously repeating over and over again. It can feel extremely irritating. A common sign that a person is becoming trapped in a time loop is that they will continue to repeat the same phrases, questions, and actions over and over again. In this situation, it's best to distract them. So, time loops I would no longer classify as time distortion. They're thought loops, and they tend to be more induced by short-term memory loss, where your train of thought breaks down before it has time to complete, and you forget what you're doing, and then it starts over and you become trapped in a loop. So I would no longer consider that a time distortion, but whatever, I was onto something. Rapid-fire thoughts, these days called thought acceleration. An effect of psychedelics that I particularly enjoy is the internal rapid-fire thoughts it generates. This is where your thought processes are sped up drastically and are much more creative and profound. When experiencing this, it literally feels like one rapid thought after the other in incredibly quick succession. This mental effect results in greatly increased clarity, problem-solving abilities, and is also accompanied by a huge amount of distractibility. There are several different cognitive effects embedded here, so, creativity enhancement, analysis enhancement, and short-term memory suppression or focus impairment. I wouldn't all lump under thought acceleration these days. Removal of cultural filter. To me, this is by far the most profound cognitive effect that psychedelic experience has to offer, as it is a permanent and life-changing perception swip that occurs consistently during all trips, if not all trips, and becomes completely grounded in a person's personality after just a few good trips. The cultural filter is an extreme bias that we look through in our everyday lives when evaluating the world around us and affects our ability to judge something for what it really is enormously. It's this filter that forces us to look at our lives and reality not as human beings, but as a false version of our true selves, be it a materialistic white middle-class male with a European Christian heritage, a Middle Eastern Muslim woman, or an Aboriginal tribesman in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. Interesting examples. The reason this filter exists within us all is because we are determined, shaped, and held back by the culture that raises us in ways that most of us feel uncomfortable thinking about. This is especially true for those among us that base their self-worth and pride on their individuality. As far as I can tell, this cultural filter is instilled so deeply within our psyches that we cannot possibly remove it using normal means, such as simply critically analysing our thought processes and decisions, but must resort to much more drastic measures, such as intense psychedelic chemical cleansing of the mind. It's this effect of the psychedelic experience that can cause an unconscious selfish idiot to enter a trip and come out 6 hours later a halfway decent human being. I think when I was young, I used to think that psychedelics were a miracle cure, that, if you just gave an evil dictator a psychedelic, they'd stop being an arsehole and chill out. I now know that isn't true. Psychedelics don't cure being an arsehole. I have bad mental health, 12 years later after a lot of tripping, and I had bad mental health then. It didn't cure me. It does help. It's a big help, but it's not a miracle cure. And back then I used to see them as a miracle cure for all of humanity's ailments. And I think I was getting a little ahead of myself, or a little unrealistic. Introspection and personal problem solving. The introspectiveness of the psychedelic experience is probably one of its more famous qualities, and in my opinion the most obvious real-world application to tripping balls. It's by far the ability to rationally think about and dissect my internal problems that has benefited me and all of the problems around me more than any other aspect of the psychedelic experience, and is also the single biggest contributor to a bad trip that most people encounter, as almost everybody comes to the overwhelming realization that they have a bit more personal problems and emotional baggage than they previously thought. Whether or not a person is capable of overcoming these struggles is the biggest factor in determining the most important decision of a person's life. Do I continue to ignore the psychedelic experience, or do I continue to browse Facebook? Oh my god. Okay, I think I had a really big ego as a 17-year-old to a certain extent, because, I don't know, I barely experienced any trauma. Now I've experienced a lot of trauma, and psychedelics don't seem as miracle cure. Maybe they were miracle cures for the problems that I had as a teenager, which were pretty shallow problems. But these days, I don't see them to be as quite as powerful as what I'm putting across here, although obviously I'm still very passionate about them. Ego death. 5+++. I have no idea what these little numbers mean next to the titles. Ego death is the highest and final mental level of the psychedelic experience that all of those who call themselves psychonauts should be striving to be emotionally stable enough to endure. Although it helps to be well mentally equipped when reaching this state, it is only the lower, more conscious states that need to be battled past, as once a stage truly sets in, there is no longer any you to have a bad trip. You are completely separated from your sense of self and your body. In its place, an endless, infinite stream of beautiful visuals and visions. Okay, I mean, yeah, I guess I don't call it ego death anymore. I'd call it ego disillusion, and break it up into different subtypes such as unity and interconnectedness, or absent selfhood, and ego. What was the last one? It was splitting, where you separate into multiple identities. It wasn't ego splitting. Whatever, it's not important. You can look it up if you really want to. So, the keys to avoiding bad trips. Being able to hold on to the fact that this new state of mind is not permanent, and that you will come down. Although the ability to keep this memory on hand has never saved me from a bad trip personally, the inability to remember this has before led people around me and many others straight into a bad trip. Being able to remember how physically safe the drug is also helps enormously. Asking it to stop is another very simple way to divert a bad trip. This method of simply talking to the trip and letting it know that what you are currently experiencing is too much can quite often be all that is needed. Okay, more ramblings about the cultural filter. HPPD. There isn't too much to write about on this subject, but I do think that the human brain's ability to experience psychedelic visuals with no drug in its system suggests to me are being unlocked by the drug rather than generated in the moment by it. As after all, if closed-eye visuals were generated in the moment by the drug, then HPPD would not be able to show me visuals when there is no drug in my system. I mean, it could continue to generate it if that's the pattern and it starts to lean into due to neuroplasticity. I don't think that was a particularly coherent train of thought. And ways in which I disrespect the trip. I'm pretty sure that 99% of you already agree with me on this one, but this is a heated discussion that I see all too often within my favourite online psychedelic communities, and I just wanted to get my opinion on it out there. For some unknown reason, many people are quite insistent on there being a right way to trip and a wrong way to trip, with the correct method usually being the original poster's preferred way to trip. These people generally disapprove of purely recreational uses of psychedelics and activities such as video games. Did I continue that? Oh, Hero is planning out trying to ask DMT entities math questions to see if they were truly all-knowing in the way that they presented themselves. Ask them math questions, time response period, find the upper limit, what's the most complex mathematical question they can answer. Potential outcomes, DMT entities fail to answer, don't exist. DMT entities pass but have upper limit. Processing limit of subconscious discovered. I was wondering if I could find the mathematical limit of the subconscious brain when it comes to processing math. Pass, but no upper limit. DMT entities exist, so I guess my idea here was that if a DMT entity that presents itself as an all-knowing god has no upper limit on the mathematical questions that you can ask them in terms of complexity, which human brains obviously do, especially for someone such as myself that has dyscalculia, then, oh my god, the DMT entities must be real. But what happened when we tried this experiment was they would just dodge the questions, as they would, because they're hallucinations, in my opinion. Okay, here's some other, keeping it polite. So, are you all knowing? Can I ask you some questions? More potential questions. How much do you know about me? Possible reintroduction of shamanism into society. Potentially world-changing, so stop being lazy. What? Okay, I don't know what I'm writing here. But yeah, this is something I've messed around with a lot over the years. One experiment I did that I found pretty interesting was when interviewing lucid dreaming characters, I would hold up my hand behind my back, say I had like 3 fingers out, and I'd say, how many fingers am I holding behind my back? And the idea was that if they could tell me, then that would confirm that dream characters experience the dream from the perspective of the scenario as a whole, instead of through the eyes of the NPC dream character. And when doing this experiment, they could never tell me how many fingers I was holding up behind my back. So unless they were deliberately tricking me, which is certainly possible, I concluded that dream characters do indeed perceive the dream through the perspective of their literal eyes that are simulated in their dream hallucinatory heads. And oh, okay. DMT experiments. Part 1. Is DMT on rails? Interesting. This article is the first of what is going to be a series of simple experiments acted out during a DMT trip in an attempt to categorize and understand the nature and behavior of the hallucinations, scenarios, and entities experienced during the DMT flash. What I've been trying to figure out, in this simple experiment, my goal was to determine simply how much control people have over their own bodies during a DMT trip. Whether or not they have a body, and in doing so, find out if the hallucination is predetermined and fixed, or if it is something that you can change the course of by acting in an outrageous way. For example, my first idea is to see if it was possible to run in the opposite direction of an entity as fast as I could the moment it appears in front of me, instead of paying attention to what it was trying to show me. And I guess what I was trying to figure out here are if DMT hallucinations are the equivalent of cutscenes, like pre-rendered cutscenes, or if they are more gameplay, as in you can make actions that change the course of what is happening. And I think I just kind of concluded that they are more like gameplay, but you're often stuck in place. One experiment we did was to have people hold video game controllers, and you could actually use the right analog stick to look around, but the left analog stick didn't work. So that was interesting. I think that only really applies to people that have grown up playing first-person shooters, so I don't think that experiment would work with boomers. Level 6B psychedelic visuals, psychedelic geometry, I guess that would be called now. Inner mechanics of human consciousness, becoming the subconscious mind, perceiving the organization and structure of your thought stream, complete integration of previously held knowledge into a felt perspective, states of unity and interconnectedness. So, level 6B psychedelic geometry is kind of visual and mental exposure to the inner mechanics of human consciousness, where you would feel and see the inner workings of your mind, your brain, or whatever, through the experience of innately readable geometric representations that are interpreted as complex, understandable concepts that feel as if they represent things like thought patterns and processes and concepts and constructs of the brain, which are very hard to verbalize. And it feels like seeing the architecture of a brain. So that was level 6B. There is a level 6A, but I don't know if I want to get into it right now. And later on, I determined that they're actually just separate effects. I thought that when geometry got to level 6, it goes up to level 8 these days, because I got better at separating the levels, but it used to be that when it got up to level 6, it would break out into level 6A and level 6B, both of which you can find on effectindex.com if you want to look into those. And yeah, I think that's the whole notepad. So I actually think this is one of the less interesting notepads that I have, but it's the first, so I hold it near and dear to me. And it was pretty fun going through all this, so I'll show you the other notepads real quick. These are the other notepads. Here's my ideas and notes, and there's a lot of stuff in these, and honestly I think the way that I wrote about things became a lot more structured and refined and interesting. So this is volume 3, this is volume 2, I think this is 2012, and this one goes into 2013. I'll go through those in 2 separate videos that I'll upload to this channel sometime soon. Alright, if you enjoyed watching this, I guess let me know, and thanks, have a good one.